If you have questions or suggestions for future podcasts, please submit them in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Not the Chinese century. Hi, I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. The 18th and 19th centuries could be considered the centuries of the United Kingdom, and the 20th century was the century of the United States. The Chinese are claiming that the 21st century is the Chinese century, both geoeconomically and geopolitically, but it's not going to happen. China will not become the world's greatest superpower, not in 2023, nor 2030, nor 2050. Why not? It's because their economic model is not aligned with reality, or, as I like to call it, the Christian worldview. The Yin Yang. First, just a little philosophy. It's a little because I'm not much of a philosopher. Now, the Chinese believe that good and bad are intermingled as shown in the Yin Yang. As it turns, good and bad move together. Their belief is that the U.S. was on top for a century, and now as the Yin Yang turns, they will be on top. They believe they have less control over their fate than Christians do, and they believe good and evil are intermingled, while we believe that good and evil are separate entities and that evil is a parasite on the good. Now, back to economics. The Japanese Center for Economic Research issues a periodic assessment of trends in the Asia-Pacific economies. And as recently as 2021, it was forecasting that China's nominal GDP would exceed America's by 2029. No longer. The Japanese think tank now estimates that the U.S. will maintain a healthy lead over the People's Republic, with U.S. GDP exceeding $41 trillion in 2035, and China's might be closer to $36 trillion. Move the labor force. When I was a PhD student in the early 1990s, experts were saying that China couldn't grow because their infrastructure was undeveloped. They didn't have the roads, water and sewer, electricity, telecommunications, nor the railroad systems that were necessary. They overcame those logistical hurdles by moving the labor force from the countryside to the burgeoning Pearl River Delta cities of Guangzhou, Shenzhen, and Dongguan. Now that was pretty easy. Just make stuff near the port, put it in a seagoing container, and it can reach any port in the world in a few days. They have experienced what economists call the catch-up effect. It's kind of like if you want to be the most improved basketball team in the conference, you start as the worst. China started out as an undeveloped country when they were freed from communist socialism starting in about 1978. They put their foot in the door of free market capitalism. But now, under Xi Jinping, they're slamming the door shut. Their economy reportedly grew at about 9% for 20 years. This year, it's down to 5%. Okay, mostly because of COVID, but that's concealing the problem of the Chinese centralized government. But the Japanese economic source I cited earlier thinks China's growth will be more like 2% or lower by 2030 because of the authoritarian rule of President Xi and the one-child policy that has shrunk the labor pool. Okay, that 2% growth compares with 3%, which the U.S. has averaged for well over 100 years. Economic freedom. Friedrich Hayek made the point that freedom is the underlying concept of an effective economic policy. It's the first of the 10 commandments of biblical economics that Sergei Sadamatov and I wrote about in our book titled Biblical Economic Policy. Now, a guy named Stu Sirk published an article in the Epoch Times recently titled Anything Mao Can Do, I Can Do Better, Xi Jinping. The article explains how China is moving backward, not forward, in political and economic freedom. He says, quote, the 20th Congress of the Chinese Communist Party was a complete triumph for President Xi Jinping. The Constitution was modified to essentially allow him to be emperor for life, and the cult of Xi is advanced daily by state-run Chinese media, end quote. Centralization still does not work is a title of my podcast 76, and it's still true. During one of my visits to China with some DBU students, as we drove by a huge apartment development, I counted the floors while one of my students counted the buildings. We estimated housing for maybe 10,000 people was sitting empty. That's the error of centralized planning. During a visit to the Beijing Olympic site in 2009, I asked, what was here before the Olympics? Well, the lie was that it was barren land. It was not. A lot of people were displaced so the Chinese Communist Party could put on a show for the world in the 2008 Olympics. What's behind the scene? A lack of freedom and private property rights that are endorsed in the New Testament. Acts 2, if you look at verses 44 and 45, they read, all the believers were together and had everything in common. They sold property and possessions to give to anyone who had need. Now, that scripture is often portrayed as an endorsement of socialism, but it's the total opposite. 4 things indicate the story's support for private property and free market capitalism. Number one, people own property. 2, they sold it in a free market. 3, they made a profit. And 4, they gave the money to those in need. Just like the disciples were pleased to have the profit-seeking intellectual capital of the people who owned all the fields, all countries seek to have those kinds of creative people made in God's image to promote their economy, except China. Intellectual assets are leaving. In his forward-thinking economic program titled Free to Choose, the great Milton Friedman predicted in 2003 that China's increasing economic freedom would lead to more political freedom. And I agreed with him because that is the usual progression of countries. As they gain economic freedom, those nouveau riche business people use their new power to force open the political freedom. But Friedman and Arnott were both wrong this time. A recent article in the Wall Street Journal was titled, Wealthy Chinese Fed Up at Home Find a Haven in Japan. The article noted that the Center for China and Globalization, a Beijing think tank, produced data in 2019 showing that the U.S. had the largest number of Chinese migrants at around 2.9 million, followed by Japan with 780,000, and then Canada and Australia. A Chinese man who owns a real estate firm in Tokyo said recently, quote, people are uneasy and frustrated because their life can be disrupted at any moment and they may be arrested in the future. So, some think, let's get out, end quote. Now, Ginger and I had a conversation with a Chinese national who sells real estate in Canada. She told us the Canadians were charging a 30% premium for Chinese who bought real estate in Canada. Now, first, that discourages foreign investment. Any country who does that will suffer economic loss. But that's not the point. The real point is what I talked about in my podcast 131, titled Abraham and Wealth Migration. China is suffering a brain drain among their most innovative and creative people. Look, people move to locales with better economic conditions. Witness just under 4 million people who've crossed the southern border of the United States in the last 2 years. People don't break the law to move to Cuba, North Korea, nor Venezuela, nor China, which is my subject today. They move to where there is greater political, economic, and religious freedom. On a relatively more micro scale, people are moving within the U.S., from California and New York to Florida and Texas. On the macro level, people are moving from China to countries with greater freedoms. The Hong Konger is the title of a very good movie made by the Acton Institute about Jimmy Lai, the founder of Giordano. Later, he started his own newspaper named Apple that challenged the Chinese aggression toward his hometown of Hong Kong. He was arrested and is in jail today because of the lack of free speech in China. His arrest has encouraged many of his fellow rich Hong Kongers to flee China. People always flee countries of less freedom for countries of greater freedom. But so often, we concentrate on political freedom and miss how it is intertwined with economic and religious freedoms. Second source. Yes, China has become the manufacturing floor for the world. You've had the same experience I had this week. I ordered an alternator for my John Deere tractor. When I opened the box, I was not surprised that the alternator was made in China. But don't worry about it. Here's another example. I was in Vietnam a few years ago with a guy who was seeking a second source for men's shirts. It's simple risk and return. Companies demand a second source in case something happens to the first. Smart businesses already have second sources outside China. Okay. Most of us believe that God gave us the freedom to accept or reject His invitation of salvation. We have to believe He wants us to be as free as possible in our economic and political lives. China is increasing control over its people that will stifle the economy as they chase intellectual assets into other countries. I'm Dave Arnott, the Christian Economist. Fear God, tell the truth, earn a profit. See you next time. For more information, please visit us online at davearnott.com. If you have questions or suggestions for future podcasts, please submit them online or in the comment section below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.